So our fourth lecture is on Peru. So it's Peru Part 1, the armed conflict. The guided questions for this week are: what was the Peruvian context for the Civil War, or the internal armed conflict, as they prefer to call it there? Who were the major players, and why did people support them? How were how were human rights invoked during the conflict? And how is the Peruvian case different from Argentina? During the pre-colonial and colonial periods, Peru was a country rich in resources, including silver and gold. It had an enterprising, hard-working, and dense population, magnificent cities and architecture, and a system of centralized government and towns connected by a vast road network. Geographically, Peru was dispersed, and its people continued to be sharply divided between the rich and the powerful, and the desperately poor. Throughout the 20th century, power in Peru passed back and forth between military and civilian rule, neither of which has managed to improve the lives of millions of mainly indigenous people who live in grinding poverty. The most important 20th century political development in Peru before 1968 was the organization of the Popular Revolutionary Alliance of America, the APRA, founded in Mexico by Aya de la Torre in 1924. APRA became Peru's first ideological, mass-based political party. The party's importance for Peruvian politics relied on its reformist ideology and its organizational capacity, appealing to labor, students, and more marginal middle sectors. This appeal prevented the emergence of more radical alternatives until the Cuban Revolution. There are some similarities between the APRA and Peronism. Like in many countries in Latin America, the Cuban Revolution inspired guerrilla movements in Peru during the 1960s. Years of intermittent military governments, along with the failed experiment of the APRA's leftist populism, which never achieved power, this pushed many Marxist groups to envision a revolution. One key individual was the agronomist, Hugo Blanco. Blanco attempted to organize a land reform movement in the country, around the city of Cusco. Blanco succeeded in leading strikes, land seizures, and putting enough pressure on the government to consider agrarian reform in the 1960s. Yet, the failure to provide adequate reforms resulted in a guerrilla movement, most prominently the Army of National Liberation, the ELN. By 1970, the movement had disbanded, and the mild reforms were put in place. These reforms were put in place by the government of Belaunde, but they were short-lived and not sufficient. On October 3, 1968, with a bloodless coup, the armed forces began a long-term institutionalized military rule in Peru, following a growing economic crisis and inadequate response to social unrest from the civilian government. The military's major statements during its 12-year peculiar revolution included a commitment to change, national pride, social solidarity, the end of dependency, a worker-managed economy, and a fully participatory democracy, which is neither capitalist nor communist, but humanistic. The military concluded that the best protection for national security was national development. Thus, I want you to think of this military government as falling between a socialist government of, say, Allende in Chile and the fascist government we saw in Argentina. The most important policy of the regime was a large-scale agrarian reform that eliminated large private land holdings. About 360,000 farm families received land between 1969 and 1980. Neighborhood organizations, worker communities also increased after 1970. In 1975, General Velasco Alvarado was replaced by General Francisco Morales Bermudez. With the exception of the agrarian reform, initiatives by the revolutionary government were slowly abandoned under Bermudez. Once the economy entered a difficult period, the military prepared for a democratic transition back to civilian rule. And in the 1979 Constitutional Assembly, national and municipal elections were set up. The Assembly granted illiterates, predominantly indigenous Peruvians, the right to vote for the first time in national and municipal elections. During this period of transition, a shift also occurred. The Marxist left became prominent contenders for the 1980 elections. Thus, there was an opening for more people to be enfranchised and able to vote, thus, more people voting for the left. The Shining Path, as we will see, moved in the opposite direction from the rest of the Peruvian left. Now we're looking for the causes of the Shining Path and the rise of the Shining Path. So in the 1960s and 1970s, Peruvian society suffered from high poverty rates, low educational levels, abysmal healthcare, and weak infrastructure. Peru's indigenous people were by far the most deprived, isolated, and forgotten members of society. One argument for the causes of the rise of the Shining Path is that the revolutionary spark in Peru was an economic crisis. Grinding poverty led so many peasants into angry action and explosive discontent in the highlands. The devastation of living standards in Peru's middle class also fueled discontent and revolutionary fervor in the higher classes, mostly in provincial areas, not the capital. Thus, the cradle of the Shining Path was in Huamanga, a city in Ayacucho, the central Andean region of Peru, as highlighted in the slide. So, what was the Shining Path? While many activists looked to the Cuban model in hopes of bringing the same transformation to their own country, a small fraction of the Peruvian left was looking further east to China and its Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 as a model for revolutionary change. Following the Sino-Soviet split, the Maoist branch of the Peruvian Communist Party was unified under the name Red Flag, Bandera Roja, in 1964. In 1970, the Shining Path breaks from Red Flag, wanting more direct and armed action. The Popular War was declared in May 1980. The Shining Path was a hierarchical organization, with its leader and founder, Abimael Guzman, a philosophy professor at the University of Huamanga, at the top. Guzman's second in command was his wife, Augusta de la Torre, and later his wife, Elena Iparraguirre. And his number 4 was Osman Morote. What was their ideology? The Shining Path strictly adhered to the tenets of Maoism, scorning all other Marxist models. They attributed a fundamental role to political violence, targeting both military and civilian enemies. The Shining Path also used child soldiers. One of the most famous testimonies is of Lurgio Gavilan, pictured on the slide. He was a child guerrilla soldier, turned military soldier, turned priest, and is now an anthropologist. The Shining Path Maoism was ritualistic. It manifested in displays of support through marches, flags, songs. Guzman was believed to embody the fourth sword of Marxism, following Marx, Lenin, and Mao. He was perceived as a philosopher king and almost deity by his followers. Yet, Guzman, who went underground following the declaration of war, was not a charismatic leader in the style of Fidel Castro. The offset of the Popular War and the first military operation occurred in May 1980, on the eve of Peru's first national elections in 17 years. Rather than resorting to clandestine actions after legitimate above-ground movement had been suppressed, as was the case in Argentina and Uruguay, the Shanipes sought to use the clandestine arena to destroy, or in their own words, expose the hypocrisy of elections. So while everyone else turned to the ballot, they burned ballot boxes. Guzman argued that Peru had a semi-feudal structure, thus democracy was impossible, and armed insurrection was the only means of revolution. The declaration of war was followed by more than a decade of guerrilla warfare that targeted police, military, and government officials, as well as a number of social reformers, political activists, and managers of agricultural collectives, arguing that even trade unionists, community activists, and human rights workers were supporters of the status quo. Shining Path cadres sought to destroy all vestiges of Peru's European heritage and replace it with a pure, rural, communal, indigenous society. The Shining Path also played on the theme of corruption to gather support. Throughout the 1980s, the Shining Path expanded its territory and numbers in Ayacucho, and following the Maoist model, Guzman's original strategy included three key phases: 1. Defensive, 2. Equilibrium, and 3. Offensive. In 1988, Guzman deviates from Mao's strategy, reaching equilibrium too early and pushing for a switch of the main theater of the insurgency from the countryside to the capital city, Lima. This was considered a premature action by many in the inner circles, and the guerrillas struggled to maintain control of the countryside. Yet, despite the ambiguities of the Shining Path's successes and numbers, the guerrilla posed a real threat to civil society, and increasingly to the capital. The triumphs of the revolutionaries was a real possibility, and the group's actions escalated in the city, such as the Tarata bombing, a terrorist attack in the heart of Lima's middle-class district. The counterinsurgency grew stronger and more unforgiving once it had reached the middle classes of Lima, keeping in mind that the worst atrocities of the war were committed in the early years in the Andean regions. So there's a lot of racism playing out as well. So who supported the Shining Path? It was in the countryside, not the urban areas, that the Shining Path developed its strongest following. The Shining Path founders targeted a particular sector, teachers, and through them, students and young people in general. The Shining Path proposed a simplified and accessible version of theory that defined itself as the only scientific truth and was legitimized through references to Marxist classics. Anthropologist Carlos Iván de Grigori wrote, quote, "The Shining Path emerges around 1970 as a product of the previous meeting between a provincial university elite and a youthful, also provincial social base that had suffered a painful process of uprooting and desperately needed an orderly and absolute explanation of the world as a means of salvation. Its discourse finds an echo principally among young people from rural Andean areas who are suffering profound changes, who demand security, seek order, They are sectors now without a place in traditional rural society, but who can find a place in modern Peru, asphyxiated by the crisis and the unemployment. End quote. The Shining Path also gained some support from peasants by publicly beating and killing widely disliked figures such as cattle rustlers, tax collectors, and wealthy local merchants. While peasants may have supported guerrillas' goals, only a small minority ever adopted its ideology. Although university professors and school teachers predominated at the top ranks of the movement, by the early 1990s there were many kinds of people in the middle and lower ranks of the Shining Path. Women were also well represented at the top ranks of the Shining Path leadership. 8 of the 19-member Central Committee were women. Women were frequently commanders of army units, carried out attacks on villages, carried out dynamite attacks, and were often assigned to carry out executions. In comparison to Cuba and other guerrillas, women in the Shining Path took active roles in both the military and communication wings. Thus, the number of women and girls in the Shining Path was unprecedented for any Latin American guerrilla movement. Now, women might have found joining the Shining Path appealing since they prohibited drinking, imposed a strict code of discipline of sexual relations, closed brothels, outlawed infidelity, gambling, and other vices. Yet, Guzman maintained a paternalistic, patriarchal control over women whom he came into contact. Women were expected to worship him and satisfy his sexual demands. So while there was unprecedented presence of women in the Shining Path, it did not mean that they had absolute equality. So what was the state's response to the Shining Path? The architect Fernando Belaunde won the 1980 elections, the ones the Shining Path boycotted, inheriting an increase in inflation from 60% in 1980 and reaching 100% in 1984, with a declining GDP and an erosion of real wages by nearly 30%. The Belaunde administration did not take the increasingly violent Shining Path seriously for almost 3 years. Only in 1982 did the government declare the Ayacucho area an emergency zone and sent in the military. By the end of his term, over 6,000 people had perished, most between 1983 and 1984. Human rights violations skyrocketed, especially from the military, who had complete control of the emergency areas. Due to the declining economy and the mishandling of the Civil War, Belaunde's party lost the following elections. In 1985, Alan Garcia won the presidency with the APRA party, the first time the APRA reached the presidency, the culmination of a 65-year struggle to reach the presidency. But it was also the first time in 40 years that an elected civilian president handed over power to an elected successor. Garcia had a forceful economic plan, installing a nationalistic leadership that challenged the international banking community. He forced limited repayments of the national debt to 10% of export earnings, fueling a domestic economic growth rate of 9% his first year and 7% his second. However, this growth was short-lived, and the second half of Garcia's presidency was a disaster for the economy. Inflation skyrocketed to 7,650% by 1990. The economy declined more than 20%. The APRA's handling of the economy contributed to economic tensions and fueled the Shining Path war against the state. The APRA's handling of the armed conflict also differed from Belaunde, his predecessor. The APRA's Counterinsurgency strategy consisted of eliminating the historical roots of discontent, poverty, and state abandonment. The lack of a military strategy resulted from a conflicting historic relationship between the APRA and the military, and the APRA's previous criticism of the military intervention and human rights violations in the emergency zones. Thus, the actual counterinsurgency strategy was non-existent because it did not work with the military. And it mainly comprised of a reorganization of the police force without much direction or success. In 1985, mass graves were discovered at the site of military massacres in Acomarca and Pucayacu. The APRA government immediately called for an investigation and for the leader of the military command to step down. This quick and severe response to human rights violations contrasted with Belaúnde's dismissal of human rights denunciations. A brief peace commission was created in 1985. However, it failed to receive adequate support from the government, and after a second attempt at organizing it, it failed. Now, let's keep clear that the interest in the APRA for investigating these massacres was because they occurred before they were in power. They were not investigating the military orders under Alan Garcia's presidency, but the previous one. By the mid-1980s, the Shining Path had begun to control several prisons in the country, especially Lima. Prisons were prime recruiting grounds for schools of ideology, for captured militants and future cadres. The Shining Path incited massive riots on June 18, 1986, taking hostages in the prisons of El Frontón, Lurigancho, and Santa Barbara. Feeling undermined, the APRA government acted to regain control of the prisons, first successfully with the women prisoners in Santa Barbara. In Lurigancho, 124 prisoners were killed extrajudiciously, and in El Frontón, 111 were also murdered after surrendering. Soon after the killings, the government recognized that some excesses were made, and in 1988, the Senate created a special commission to investigate the causes of the violence and how to pacify the country. Headed by Senator Enrique Bernales, the commission developed concrete recommendations for new counterinsurgency strategies. However, the government failed to abide by any of them. The military prisons, especially El Frontón, were soon declared restricted military zones and thus prevented further investigations. The aftermath of the massacre benefited the Shining Path crusade to delegitimize the government. The subversives declared June 18th the Day of Heroism and appealed to both national and international human rights organizations. In response, the state took a harder stand against terrorism, especially decreeing a law against apology of terrorism, meaning if you were found to sympathize, you could be charged as a terrorist. The government and APRA authorities avoided pointing fingers at the human rights abuses on behalf of the military. This created a new form of tolerance. The massacres also heightened the animosity between the APRA and the Shining Path, resulting in the Shining Path assassination of several government community leaders linked to the APRA party. The 1990s. So in 1990, Alberto Fujimori was elected president. A member of Peru's small Asian community comprised of Chinese and Japanese immigrants, Fujimori was a middle-class entrepreneur who rose in politics through business connections. He ran on a platform of being a political outsider, appealing to Peruvians who were tired of the old political parties and failures. Fujimori's election was welcomed by the military, for he fit into their plan to install a secret military government behind a controlled civilian president. This was called the Green Plan and was headed by Fujimori's soon-to-be advisor, Vladimiro Montesinos. Following the plan, Fujimori imposed a series of neoliberal reforms known as the Fuji Shock or Fuji Shock. These reforms brought unprecedented levels of inflation, adding to the already heightened economic crisis. The reforms also pushed several million Peruvians under the poverty line, about 60 to 70% of the population. On April 5th, 1992, Fujimori, with the armed forces' support, dissolved Congress, the judiciary, and the General Accounting Office, and began to rule by decree in a self-coup. After national and international backlash, Fujimori agreed to electoral restoration in 1 year, starting with a constitutional convention in 1992. The coup allowed Fujimori to pass strict anti-terrorism decrees without the impediment of the Senate or Congress. Decrees such as the death penalty for terrorists and the institution of faceless judges who would wear hoods and allow no defense lawyers for those accused of terrorism. Fujimori brought a stronger and more militaristic approach to fighting the Shining Path, especially in the city. The decrees broadened the police control in the prisons. He sent support for peasants in self-defense groups and allowed for military control of universities and military civic actions in shantytowns, where the Shining Path proved to have a strong recruiting ground. One notable case of human rights violations perpetuated by the Fujimori regime was the Cantuta massacre. On July 18, 1992, it was the disappearance of one professor and 9 students from the Universidad Enrique Guzmán y Valle, commonly called La Cantuta. The armed forces kidnapped the students and professor from their residence hall, and they were never seen again alive. It would later be known that the massacre was the work of a secret squadron, Grupo Colina, directed by Fujimori and Montesinos. In 1993, an attempt to hold those responsible for the Cantuta massacre held 2 officers accountable. However, after his re-election in 1995, Fujimori passed a law of amnesty, protecting all military and police for excesses that occurred during the internal armed conflict. What caused the Shining Path to lose support? Well, during the war and after, the Shining Path became known more for its atrocities against peasants than its ability to redress the grievances of the poor. The Shining Path attempt to destroy all of the previous order failed to understand the realities of those they claimed to fight for. Shining Path leaders did not recognize that most of Peru's rural communities were in fact economically linked to markets. They did not anticipate that their prohibition against sales of peasant products in local markets would spark such resentment as it did, and they failed to modify their thinking upon the outbreak of this resentment. They basically cut off all their economic progress and businesses. Thus, peasants suffered greatly in poverty, and many had nothing to eat. The hyper-classist Shining Path not only rejected ethnicity as an issue, but did not respect traditional indigenous culture. Its leadership was, after all, made up of mestizo provincial elites. Excessive violence was perhaps the determining factor leading to the Shining Path's defeat. Mao's famous quote goes, "From the barrel of a gun grows political power." For Mao, revolutionary violence is an important force which can transform many things or open the way for their transformation. For the Shining Path, those who stood in its way were the enemy, and even if they were unarmed civilians, should be assassinated. Unlike most previous Latin American guerrilla movements, only 17% of Shining Path victims were members of the military or or police. Thus, most victims were actually unarmed civilians. For perhaps the first time in Latin America, nuns, priests, journalists, agronomists, food aid workers, and even human rights activists were directly targeted and killed not by the government, but by guerrillas. The Shining Path killed, not only routinely, but savagely. But keep in mind that the government did also target some human rights activists and political organizers, but not to the scale of regimes in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, or Chile. The capture of Abimael Guzman on September 12, 1992, marked the end of the Shining Path threat, and the group succumbed to internal conflicts and an eventual peace agreement signed by Guzman in 1993. Parallel to the Shining Path, the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement launched its armed revolution in 1984. The Lima-based MRTA based itself on the Cuban guerrillas. When the APRA came into power, the MRTA made a temporary ceasefire, believing that the new government would provide the changes and reforms chosen by the people. After the APRA government failed to deliver, the MRTA resumed its activities, kidnapping businessmen, asking for ransom, and bombing foreign assets in the capital. The MRTA spread in the Amazon district of San Martin, more than the highlands, and is often linked with drug trafficking. Two notable actions of the group include a prison escape comprised of a tunnel dug from outside the Canto Grande prison, and the taking of the Japanese embassy in 1997, seeking to liberate imprisoned members. The embassy takeover was a last attempt to legitimize its revolution, failing at the hands of Fujimori's military operation. The MRTA, while it was still a powerful presence, it is often overlooked, especially because the Shining Path was so much larger. Um, However, it is important to mention that there were other groups that emerged from this discontent and kind of economic situation and inequalities in Peru during this period. So the conflict, the Peruvian internal armed conflict, is understood to have ended in the year 2000 with the resignation of Fujimori from exile in Japan after facing corruption charges during his third run for president. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission begins under President Alejandro Toledo in 2001 and is completed in 2003. It includes 17,000 voluntary testimonies. The key findings of the Truth Commission are the following. The number of victims supersedes 69,000, either killed or disappeared by the subversives and the agents of the state. Of each 4 victims, 3 were Quechua-speaking peasants. The Shining Path was responsible for 54% of deaths. The Peruvian state was responsible for 37% of deaths. And 83% of the sexual violence carried out was attributed to state officials. The commission found that there was no sector of society without some sort of responsibility for the violence that occurred, implicating the media and human rights organizations as well. This brought mixed responses to the report, and until today, much skepticism. Today, Fujimori, Guzman, and other top Shining Path cadres, Montesinos, the head of intelligence, Victor Polay, the MRTA leader, are in prison. Some face corruption charges and not human rights and not charges for human rights violations. But still, tensions and a resurfacing of the shining path in modern contemporary Peru continue to hold a memory of the internal armed conflict as contested. Next week, we will resume with a closer look at the truth commissions, general truth commissions, accountability, Fujimori's trial, the human rights groups that worked during the internal armed conflict, and memory in the Peruvian case. So we go back to our guiding questions. What was the Peruvian context for the Civil War? Who were the major players and why did people support them? How were human rights evoked during the conflict? And how is the Peruvian case different from Argentina?